Yellowstone National Park was one of the many national parks forced to close down during the government shutdown in October 2013. This occurred because the United States legislature could not agree over a national budget. Part of the debate centered on the U.S. national debt. In this chapter, we will discuss fiscal policy, which is the policy related to government spending and taxation. The government must pass and adhere to a budget. That is, its forecast total tax revenues and other revenue sources, and it also sets spending levels for different government programs and initiatives. When more revenues are collected than the government spends, this is called a budget surplus. The opposite is called a budget deficit. Since 1960, total federal spending has ranged from about 18% to 22% of GDP, although it climbed above that level in 2009. The share spent on national defense has generally declined, while the share spent on Social Security and on healthcare expenses, mainly Medicare and Medicaid, has increased. About 71% of government spending goes to four major areas: national defense, Social Security, healthcare, and interest payments on past borrowing. This leaves about 29% of federal spending for all the other functions of the U.S. government. Spending by state and local governments increased from about 10% of GDP in the early 1960s to 14 to 16% by the mid-1970s. It has remained at roughly that level since. The single biggest spending item is education, including both K-12 spending and support for public colleges and universities, which has been about 5 to 6% of GDP in recent decades. Federal tax revenues have remained relatively unchanged at about 17 to 20% of GDP during most periods in recent decades. The primary sources of federal taxes are individual income taxes and the payroll taxes that finance Social Security and Medicare. Corporate income taxes, excise taxes, and other taxes provide smaller shares of revenue. There are three main types of taxes that occur. The first is a proportional tax, otherwise known as a flat tax. This is where the tax burden is spread evenly in the form of a fixed percent on income or property value. A regressive tax acts by levying less tax per dollar as income or wealth increases. A progressive tax does the opposite and taxes more heavily per dollar as income or wealth increases. Over the years, state and local tax revenues have increased to match the rise in state and local spending. The federal government has run budget deficits for decades. The budget was briefly in surplus in the late 1990s before heading into deficit again in the first decade of the 2000s, and especially deep deficits in the recession of 2008 and 2009. Why do governments spend more than they earn during a recession? This deficit spending is linked to fiscal policy. There are two types of fiscal policy. First, expansionary fiscal policy, and second, contractionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy requires the government to operate at a deficit, which ideally will boost GDP and lay the investment groundwork for future economic expansion and recovery. If inflationary pressures are high and the economy is operating at or above potential GDP, governments may operate at a budget surplus, trying to slow down or contract the economy to a more sustainable level. Federal debt is the sum of annual budget deficits and surpluses. Annual deficits do not always mean that the debt to GDP ratio is rising. During the 1960s and 1970s, the government often ran small deficits. But since the debt was growing more slowly than the economy, the debt to GDP ratio was declining over this time. In the 2008-2009 recession, the debt GDP ratio rose sharply. When government spending exceeds taxes, the gap is the budget deficit. When taxes exceed spending, the budget is a budget surplus. The recessionary period starting in late 2007 saw higher spending and lower taxes, combining to create a large deficit in 2009. Let's look through some scenarios on how an expansionary fiscal policy or a contractionary fiscal policy impacts aggregate supply and aggregate demand. In this well-functioning economy, each year aggregate supply and aggregate demand shift to the right, so that the economy proceeds from equilibrium EO to E1 to E2. Each year, the economy produces that potential GDP with only a small inflationary increase in the price level. But if aggregate demand does not smoothly shift to the right and match increases in aggregate supply, growth with deflation can develop. In this economy, the original equilibrium, EO, represents a recession occurring at a quantity of output, YO, below potential GDP. However, a shift of aggregate demand from ADO to AD1, enacted through an expansionary fiscal policy, can move the economy to a new equilibrium output of E1 at the level of potential GDP, since the economy was originally producing below potential GDP. An inflationary increase in the price level from PO to P1 that results should be relatively small. In this graph, the economy starts at the equilibrium quantity of output YO, which is above potential GDP. The extremely high level of aggregate demand will generate inflationary increases in the price level. A contractionary fiscal policy can shift aggregate demand down from ADO to AD1, leading to a new equilibrium output, E1, which occurs at potential GDP. So far, we've focused on the discretionary side of fiscal policy, which is the ability for the government to explicitly pass law and change taxation or spending levels. It is important to note that economies may also have built-in automatic economic stabilizers. For example, unemployment insurance is an automatic stabilizer by providing unemployed consumers funds during recession to bolster demand. On the flip side, unemployment funds are much smaller during good economic time, which means that demand will be dampened because the source of funding is not available. The standardized employment budget is a calculated number showing the impact of automatic stabilizers. This figure shows the deficit or surplus amount not needed because of the automatic stabilizers. This graph shows the impact of the standardized employment budget. When the economy is in recession, the standardized employment budget deficit is less than the actual budget deficit because the economy is below potential GDP and the automatic stabilizers are reducing taxes and increasing spending. When the economy is performing extremely well, the standardized employment deficit or surplus is higher than the actual budget deficit or surplus because the economy is producing at about potential GDP. So the automatic stabilizers are increasing taxes and reducing the need for government spending. Fiscal policy also has an impact on the price of financial capital, or in other words, the interest rate. When a government borrows money in the financial capital market, it causes a shift in the demand for financial capital from DO to D1. As the equilibrium moves from EO to E1, the equilibrium interest rate rises from 6% to 7% in this example. In this way, an expansionary fiscal policy intended to shift aggregate demand to the right can also lead to a higher interest rate, which has the effect of shifting aggregate demand back to the left.